Thank you to Sakuraco and TokyoTreat for sponsoring today's video. Hey guys, welcome back to another video. So today's video is kind of similar to Saturday's video where I drew almost kind of like a redraw of Xiangling from Genshin Impact, but today we are going to be doing one for Chongyun instead. So in the past, at least for like a few videos, I've talked about wanting to do almost a redraw or a revamp of some of my old Genshin drawings. One is to kind of like replace a lot of my old Genshin prints because they're like over 4 years old, or like, yeah, well, 4 years old, I think, at this point. And I want to put out new illustrations because my style does look a little bit different, as well as the fact that I feel like they're a little bit too plain. A lot of them have like the simple plain background. I'll put examples on the screen of what my previous Chongyun drawings actually look like. So if I remember correctly, the one with the pink background is from Ibis Paint, and the one with the blue background is from Procreate. I don't really remember which one was before the other. Looking at the style, I would assume that the one on Ibis Paint was drawn prior to the one that I did on Procreate, but I'm not too sure about my color choices, which is kind of like throwing me off. So yeah, we're going to be redrawing Chongyun today, and the reason why I don't really want to call this one specifically a redraw is that it's not really like a nod in any direction to either of the previous pieces that I've done. It seems like just a completely different illustration, kind of similar to like the one that I did of Zhongli for Saturday's start to finish video. That one is also very much, doesn't look anything really the same in terms of my previous drawings. It's like a completely own illustration, but I just want to put the comparisons up because I do like seeing the difference and the improvements, or like my preferences, because there's like small things here and there that maybe I'll talk about in the coloring portion that I can still see. I still have like similar preferences or habits that I still do. So let's talk about the process a little bit. Now, after the Procreate update, I think it's 5.4, some of my brushes, mostly like the ink brush that I've been using more recently, has changed and it became kind of unusable. So I switched back using my normal paintbrush, which is based off of the Jing Sketches brush set. And I'm using that one to plan out the rough sketch for Chongyun's pose so that we can keep our sketch a little bit cleaner. So after I get the rough sketch done, I lower the opacity and we make a new layer and start to sketch with the sketch round to kind of flesh everything out. I think that's like another difference from how I used to draw in the past and now is the fact that because I know my process a little bit better nowadays and it's more with intent rather than like just pure laziness on my part. So in the past, I would sketch directly what I wanted onto one layer, and I would use that sketch to, you know, act as my line art or act as like my drawing base kind of thing, add colors that I merge and render. And that's still very much the same process that I still do now. But the difference is that I like doing a rough sketch first, and oftentimes with a larger brush, so that we can just kind of get the general shapes and composition or whatever I want to have planned out of the gate. Just get it on the paper or canvas right at the very beginning, and then we can flesh out the sketch and use a little bit less guidelines to keep my sketch a lot cleaner. Also, previously back then, I don't think the Chongyun with the blue background was done with this method, but I used to merge the character with the background, which is very detrimental for me, especially as somebody who isn't like super painterly. I feel like if you do treat it the same way as you work traditionally, where maybe you're gonna build up the background alongside with the character at the same time. Now, obviously, traditional art has a little bit more leniency with like things are a little bit more permanent compared to doing stuff digitally. But for me, I will keep those elements separately and I will allow myself to use a lot more layers nowadays compared to back then when I would only use maybe maximum of 5, just because I was not really used to the Procreate interface and I didn't like having my layers take up too much space or having to open up the layer window over and over again. So there's like different preferences back then compared to now, and like some choices that I kind of regret doing. I did have a bit of a plan on what I wanted to do for the background, but we'll talk about that once we get to the coloring portion. With the sketch being finished, you know what else is almost finished? September. So with October just around the corner, Halloween is also on its way very, very soon. So let me show you some snacks for Halloween and or the autumn season via TokyoTreat and Sakuraco. TokyoTreat is a fun and exclusive Japanese snack box featuring unique and exclusive flavors straight from Japan. Each box is filled with a variety of full-size Japanese snack items like limited edition Kit Kats, uniquely flavored Japanese chips, and occasional Japanese sodas that are only available in Japan for a limited time. This box in particular is themed around Halloween, if you can't tell, and there's so many tasty Halloween snacks with very cute design and packaging, which I always love. While Sakuraco is a monthly Japanese artisan snack box that supports local Japanese snack makers, each box comes with 20 traditional, authentic, and artisan Japanese snacks, including Japanese teas and a special Japanese tableware. I was actually super delighted seeing the Neko Furushiki, which is this really cute green, red, black, and gold fabric with these little cute cat designs on it. It felt very autumn to me, but also very Masaki-esque. So you actually get a random design from 3 different variations, and I'm super pleased that I have this one in particular. Both of the boxes come with a 24-page cultural guide, and I love that it includes information both on ingredients or allergens of each of the snacks, but also informs you about small tidbits of information revolving around culture and traditions in Japan. You can learn more about Halloween in Japan or even just about the autumn season in Nikko. Each month has a different theme, meaning that you get to try out a whole new selection of new treats and snacks every month. For example, TokyoTreat's box theme for the month of October is Snacktacular Halloween, while Sakuraco's box for the month of October is Nikko's Autumn Splendor. So as usual, let's go ahead and check out this month's tea from Sakuraco. So this is the Autumn Sencha, which kind of has like a lighter feeling to the tea. It's very relaxing to drink. I think it's also not very strong in taste, and it pairs very well with some of the sweeter snacks that are found in both of these boxes, like the Momiji Manju from the Sakuraco box, as well as the apple pie Kit Kats from TokyoTreat. Now, this Kit Kat tastes a lot like apple pie and has that very nice kind of warm feeling to them, but my favorite has to be the mystery marshmallows because it's kind of like a cross between a marshmallow and a gummy, and I feel like I'm a little bit more particular, but this is like has the perfect consistency to me. But also, the Ghoulicious garlic chips, it has like such a cute design for the packaging, but it has like a very strong, pleasant garlic taste, but it's like kind of like on a thick senbei like chip. So this one's probably my favorite out of all the snacks, but I'm also like more of a savory snack girly. If you'd like to get a box for yourself, or you would like to get these as a lovely gift for any of your friends or family, then do check out the links in the description. Thank you again to Sakuraco and TokyoTreat for sponsoring today's video. Now let's go ahead and try to establish our environment for Chongyun. So I feel like when I've been doing some of these redraws, it's a little bit more prevalent, I feel like, for Kaya and Amber's probably, as well as a little bit of Xiangling, is that occasionally I will actually boot up the game again, fly to the location that I imagine them kind of like interacting or being in, and then taking a screenshot or two to kind of give me a little bit boost of inspiration on how I want to exactly do the background. I think Amber is the only one where I followed a little bit more closely to the actual like infrastructure or the environment, so that it kind of made sense that she was in Mondstadt. So the one that I wanted for Chongyun is that I knew I wanted more of an autumn vibe. I'm very heavily influenced with the fact that autumn and just like fall in general is my favorite season. And it's mostly because like I love the warmer colors. It kind of gives like a nice, almost like a gradient during the season. You see it go from green to yellow to kind of like orange, you know, like all those really pretty colors in nature. And it gets really golden outside and I really love it. And I guess like where I live in Canada, we can see the mountains, but we have like a lot of trees and stuff. So I wanted to incorporate a little bit more of that almost golden warmth to the piece. But you know, Chongyun's kind of like color palette, it's very much on the cooler side. So it's a lot of stark white, a lot of blues, there's some blacks and some golds, but it's very much on the cooler tone side. So I kind of want to have a little bit of contrast, and I'll explain a little bit more about my coloring decisions once we get to adding effects as well as like little bit of shadow and stuff into his particular coloring. But because I'm focused on the background, I was kind of like going back and forth trying to figure out the color temperature as well as just like the general hue that I wanted, because the background that I ended up going with is just looking at the little tiles and kind of steps or any of the stone fixtures in Liyue. So I was looking more of like places that had like the stairs and stuff, and looking that I could potentially draw like a very quick version of some of those stone steps and then just blur it out so it has enough detail to stand on its own, but then I don't have to make it super detailed or super accurate. So hopefully, as long as you're not falling too close to some of the details in like the little lines of like the little stone bricks or whatever, then we should be okay. As for the shadow on more or less on the right side, where I wanted to have kind of like speckled, dappled lighting for the ground or the surface. So I ended up using a multiply layer with a bluish purple and then making a bunch of shapes. And then I ended up doing like a Gaussian blur to make it a little bit less, strong and not with sharp lines. Then after that, went ahead with an add layer, added more of a golden light color and added that in for more of that dappled lighting look. We add one more warm layer towards kind of the left-hand side for a little bit more brightness and light. So I still wanted to have a little bit more warmth into the background, but I didn't want it to get too orangey or too pink or too purple. So I wanted to add a little bit more of those cooler shadows here and there before we start to figure out how I exactly wanted to color in Chongyun. So for Chongyun, we make a new layer underneath our sketch. I went ahead and used the lasso tool with the color fill option on. And before I even did that, I've been kind of experimenting a little bit lately. Maybe I can do a video talking a little bit more about the idea of how I use certain blend modes for my illustrations, because I use add a lot, I use overlay, and I use multiply. And multiply, I have a love-hate relationship when it comes to using it for my sketch. It works very well whenever I have to lighten my lines or I want to have the lines kind of, change to a specific hue or a specific color, which I do like, as well as just being able to use it for like shadows or darkening things up. I think it's very helpful, and kind of using the opposite if I use a screen layer. But when I start to merge down my sketch onto my rough colors, if there's not really a color present underneath the multiply layer lines, then they revert back to as if they never had the effect on after I merged them, because they revert back to a normal layer. So to keep the effect, you would actually have to have like something underneath and have the color like be visually represented the way you want it before you merge, if that makes sense. I'll talk about it maybe in a different video. So instead, I ended up duplicating my sketch and then pre-filling in the colors and merging those together as my base, so that at least for the most part, when I end up merging my lines with my color or like my base rough color, whatever you want to call it, then hopefully it'll change a little bit less. And for the most part, it works quite well from, I think, the last 2 or 3 illustrations that I've done, that kind of method. But when I ended up doing it for Chongyun, it didn't really work. And I don't know if it's because I made the lines still too light in general, but I think it's also because I had too many stray little pieces or things like exceeding outside of my sketch lines regardless. So I just gave it that messier look. And it's probably more noticeable because Chongyun's hair is very much on the lighter side and my background had enough contrast. So it just became a lot more noticeable. So at this point, I was still debating on a few things in terms of the coloring. So I knew that I was going to eventually do dapple lighting on top of Chongyun's hair and or like on his shoulder, which is like the closest side to the right side of the canvas, but I was not too sure if I wanted to add an overlay layer to change the overall color scheme. Now I use overlay layers a lot to help adjust colors or place characters into their environment, but maybe, if like I'm kind of struggling thinking like, oh, I don't know what color it looks like under this lighting, all that jazz, I will color the character just as normal, as if only thing that's really affecting the character is kind of the lighting situation. And maybe a little bit if there's like color temperature, I'll try to keep it in mind. But if there's like a very strong presence of a specific color temperature, let's say we're like underneath like a moonlit area or something that has like a very bright kind of golden hour-ish color, then I will try to make sure that, you know, after I get a general base done, I'll use like multiply layer, I'll use an overlay, I'll use an add layer to kind of mimic the lighting on top of my already preset. I don't remember what I was talking about. If you heard like the little chimer jingle, I have like an 8-bit version of, I think it's Pretty You by 17 as like my ringtone, so I do apologize. I'm pretty sure I was talking about the lighting situation. So at this point, like as I was finishing up coloring Chongyun, we're on the step where I adjust my sketch lines to make it a little bit more on the softer side, because I noticed more recently that I prefer keeping my sketch lines lighter so that I can manually add more contrast, and it gives me a little bit more like variation rather than having to paint over dark lines with a lighter color. If I want it to be lighter, it's just much easier for me to transition darker colors into the lighter lines versus the other way. So after I have those established, at this point, I think I've already merged my lines down to the sketch of Chongyun, and I went ahead and added a new layer above all of that with a multiply layer, and I clipped it to the merged layer that has like my sketch and the base of Chongyun, and so we can kind of like add a little bit more contrast, because I was losing a little bit of shadows near his hood where his head is, as well as a little bit into his hair and on his shirt. So after that, I went ahead and merged it one more time, and we can start to render. So at this point, rendering, I'm just doing a lot of cleanup. I'm doing a lot more like painting over the entire piece. So you could do this on a separate layer on top of everything, but occasionally when I have to do like the edges of Chongyun, let's say his hair or his like shirt or his hood, then I need to be able to erase rather than paint over. So I just find it easier painting all on top of one layer, unless I feel like I'm not confident on how to paint over it. So maybe I'll put it on a separate layer and then I can toggle it on and off to see whether or not I like what it looks like or not. I'll also think I'll include a picture at the very end, because I ended up doing this maybe because I want to make it into a short. We'll see, because I usually never have this hindsight ready for myself whenever I want to record something like a short or anything like that. So I would actually keep a version of my merged color and sketch together so that I can toggle it on and off to see what it looks like in comparison to a fully rendered version. I'll probably add it in near like the end of the time lapse at the very end of the video so that I don't spoil exactly what Chongyun is gonna look like. So at this point, I ended up just rendering Chongyun as normal, and I was kind of thinking whether or not I was still going to drastically change the color temperature, at least like on the left-hand side of the canvas for Chongyun, to make it a lot warmer. But I noticed that I think the one of Xiangling, it's a little bit too one-note colored, if that makes sense. For me, I think I like that Chongyun kind of is a little bit more like coolly contrasted with the rest. And I don't think he's gonna look too out of the ordinary or like not within the environment too much, because of the context of like the shadows and stuff, and me adding the extra dapple lighting later. It kind of helps brings it together without needing to heavily influence the color temperature overall. I'll kind of like show what I mean a little bit later, because like I mentioned, at some point I do like putting the character more into a shadow, have more dramatic lighting, rim lighting, or whatever. But for the one of Chongyun, because the lighting is not exactly my typical like backlighting, I found it a little bit easier getting away with not needing such a drastic color change, as well as like not dramatic lighting, if that makes sense. So at this point, I'm getting a little bit too ahead of myself, so we'll just render as normal at this point. And I think in the past as well, whenever I tried doing more of like a dappled lighting, I've also merged those layers right onto the character, which like I said is kind of like a bad approach. I should be able to keep it on separate layers so that I'm able to manipulate or change, or like in this case, it was easier for me to change like elements separately. And that's like something I do regret doing a lot when I was working in Procreate, and I was kind of like trying to minimize the amount of layers that I had. And I thought at some point it was making it easier for myself, but I'm noticing more recently that the more complicated the drawings are, or like the more detail I want to add or adjust, or like if I don't do like proper planning and I need to adjust on the fly, if I have too many things merged together, it requires a lot of things to be painted over, which really sucks. And I'm having more of this realization mostly because I'm working on I'm like part of a project, a fan project, and I'm required to draw like 4 full bodies. And I don't really draw full bodies like super often. And usually this wouldn't be too much of a problem if I have like a background or whatever. But I'm noticing a lot of the times like my edges of my drawings or illustrations or things that I don't like require so much fixing afterwards that I have to do so much like painting over. So if I kept things a little bit more separately before merging everything, it would make, you know, some steps a little bit easier for myself. So I'm trying my best to find more optimal ways. I don't really want to change completely the way that I work because I know how it works for myself, and it, you know, overall I do like the end result. I just think that like stuff similar to like if I were to rely more on line work, my lines I wouldn't really have to paint over and over again. I wouldn't accidentally paint over my lines, so having to go back and doing that again, or having an option to use like color filling because you have more structured lines might be a little bit easier. Or even just like maybe I could be a little bit more looser. There's like a lot of things that could go one way or the other that might remedy or speed up the process, but at this point speed's not really the goal here. And I hope for like you as an artist, if you do end up doing like drawing, painting, creating, whatever, I hope speed is not your priority as long as it's not like on a deadline or anything like that. I think speed comes with like the more you get comfortable with something or more familiar with the process, that you end up picking up more speed, you start finding shortcuts and stuff. But for me, I think I developed a little bit of a problem early on where I was relying too much on the fact that I wanted to use as little layers as possible because of me being like, oh, I want to open up my layers less often because I don't like not being able to have it on the screen at all times. And I know one kind of like aspect of Procreate that a lot of people do like, or you might be on the opposite end and you really dislike it, is the fact that it has more of a minimalistic interface. Things are hidden and all that. And for me, at least working on the iPad, I don't like my space being too cluttered. So even having the reference window sometimes is a hindrance. So I don't really like having, let's say, a floating color wheel or having my layers open all the time, or you know, I do like the minimal kind of aspect to Procreate, and I've gotten used to it. So at that point, I think I was creating my own problem where I was forcing myself to use less layers and it was making things a lot more difficult. But I think you guys understand because I probably worded the same problem 3 times in the sitting. But we are pretty much finished with the coloring portion of Chongyun. There's like small details I was trying to fix up here and there before we start to kind of finished the last part, which happens to be more of like the dappled lighting on top of Chongyun's head. I also ended up draping it a little bit more onto his shoulders as well, because if it's kind of from up above, I want it to be more aligned. So like I could have also made his entire arm that's on the right side more into shadow just in general, because it won't be getting hit by the light more or less anyways. But for simplicity's sake, I just ended up doing a very simple dapple lighting so that it can stay consistent with what I had in the background, and I'm following very similar steps. So multiply layer, I did end up like alpha locking this layer, adding a little bit more of a purpley or warmer tinge to the edges, made another new layer that's like an add layer to add in a little bit more of like the warmer golden light coming through. And then it did look still a little bit sparse. I forgot that I added this into my sketch, but I wanted to have like fallen leaves in the background on the steps. But because I didn't end up doing that, I ended up just filling the space as I usually do, which is some falling petals. We used the Gaussian blur to make them a little bit out of focus, you know, add a little bit more depth. I used some motion blur on some other ones, and I think that's it for today's illustration. So here's in comparison to the other 2 Chongyuns that I did. I am almost 100% sure that this second Chongyun, this one that we're looking at right now, I think that one was the second Chongyun that I drew, not the one that had the pink background. I'm just confused about my color choices because blue on blue was not the best kind of choice for me to make. But granted, a lot of my portraits that I did of Genshin characters were just on a blue canvas, and I don't really remember if that one was one of the merged ones where I mentioned I merged a character with the background. Hence why a lot of them just had like straight up plain colored backgrounds, because it was easier for me to keep the character nice and clean and crisp all the way around without having to worry about like blurred colors, gradations, patterning, all that. But with the time lapse out of the way, I'll show the screenshot of like the before and after of what Chongyun looked like before rendering and after rendering. But like I mentioned, I think that's it for today's video. So hopefully you guys enjoyed watching me draw Chongyun, since it's been a super long time and he's still a character I really enjoy. And maybe next time I'll draw Xingqiu as well. But I think that's it for today, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye!